So welcome everyone who's joining us today. This is the Iowa Ideas In-Depth Week. Our focus this week is on the urban-rural divide. And the name of our session today is Keeping Education Vibrant in Rural Communities. I'm Vanessa Miller. I cover higher education for the Gazette. And I will be the moderator today. In a second, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they do and why they have knowledge on this issue. But I also just wanted to let people know that if you have questions that you come up with as we're talking during the discussion, feel free to throw those into the chat, and then I can bring those to our panelists as they sort of come to you to kind of keep the conversation flowing that way. So yeah, but I guess we could just start with our panelists today, just introducing themselves, and we also have Rob Barron who will be joining us in a bit. So yeah, why don't you go ahead and start, Lisa, Dr. Remy.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Lisa Remy, and I have the pleasure of serving as Executive Director for School Administrators of Iowa. School Administrators of Iowa, we're a membership organization. We provide service to all levels of administration, from assistant principals through superintendents and all in between. We provide predominantly in the areas of professional learning, legal advice, advocacy, as well as mentoring.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kathy Franken. I am the interim president at Upper Iowa University and the CFO currently. I've been with the university for about 15 years. We have a long, rich history serving Northeast Iowa and states and communities beyond with our online program. But really the heart of our institution is in Fayette, Iowa, which is a very small rural community in Northeast Iowa.
Great, thank you. And I guess I just wanted to start by asking you both to kind of talk a little bit about the landscape of education, both at the K through 12 level and the higher education level in the rural portions of the Midwest.
So I can start off here from the higher education side. In the rural setting, and probably similar to the K-12 system, there is the population decline that is occurring that definitely trickles to higher education, you know, after their students are coming out of the K-12, just simply having fewer students that everyone is competing for. And I would say the other piece of it is that student demands are changing a bit in higher education as well, in regard to amenities and the services and things that they are wanting out of the higher education experience. One of the key ones is obviously that digital component and the demand for online, because they're coming out of the K-12 system, you know, with some of that experience there, but really that population and really higher education as a whole, really competing for just a fewer number of students overall.
Sure, and can you talk, Dr. Remy, about the K through 12 portion?
Sure, absolutely. I would say it's similar. So as we, you know, depending upon where you're at in the state, you're seeing some population decline, as well as then in other parts of the state where there are school districts that are growing at 400 to 500 a year. So it's different depending upon where you're at in the state. I would say what we've seen, though the demographics in the state of Iowa have changed, which has had an impact on schools, funding, which we'll get into some of this later, the teacher shortage, student behavior. So some of that we'll talk probably more in depth later, but those are some of the differences that our educators are faced with today versus 5 years ago.
Yeah, great. And I do want to mention that we've had our panelists join us, Rob Barron, with the Iowa Minnesota Campus Compact. So do you want to take a few minutes, Rob, and just introduce yourself and like what your organization does?
Sure. Thanks, Vanessa. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm Rob Barron. I'm the Executive Director of Iowa Minnesota Campus Compact. We're a dues-paying coalition of about 50 colleges and universities in Iowa and Minnesota that are focused on community and civic engagement. So we work with our campuses on professional development. We have opportunities for students, staff, and faculty to get engaged in their community. We work on things like student voting and promoting voting access for students. And we've been doing this work now for about 30 years in Minnesota, 20 here in Iowa. I also served 8 years as a board member for the Des Moines Public Schools Board of Education. And so I've gotten to see what we're talking about from a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. And thanks to all of you for being here again. I guess I just want to start by, well, we already did some starting, but I wanted to ask you, and some of you kind of mentioned this a little bit, what some of the biggest challenges are facing rural education right now. And that would maybe even be a little different than what's facing some of the urban, school districts or colleges. Like what specifically might be a challenge or some of them in rural Iowa or the rural Midwest?
Yeah, I can.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Sorry. I'll start thinking about the pre-K through 12 setting. So transportation is one of those areas different than in more of our suburban or urban centers. So when you think about the square miles of a district and the cost of transportation in some of our rural communities, it's a much larger part of their budget than it is in a suburban or an urban setting. Now, the state legislature has taken some steps over the last couple of years to try to have some transportation funding equity, but it hasn't gotten to a point where it's completely equitable across the state. So that is something that faces our rural. And then I would also say teacher shortages are hitting all aspects, and it's even more than teacher shortages. It's also other staff, bus drivers, custodians, nutrition workers, childcare workers. But I would say in our rural communities, we're seeing where they don't have any applicants, and where we see, and that's different than in our suburban or urban, there are fewer applicants, but there are applicants, even for positions like a first grade teacher, third grade teacher, where we used to have hundreds of applications. So I think that's something that's also very different.
Yeah, and I would probably, on some of those same lines, the employment pools, at the higher education level is similar to what Lisa was just describing for the K-12 system. Really just the ability to attract new individuals or families to the rural communities is becoming a greater challenge right now. And I'd say the secondary challenge, and I hit on it just a little bit, is just for our students that aren't coming from rural settings, just that expectation and that comfort level with some of the amenities that maybe just don't, they don't exist in that rural setting.
Right. And I mean, are there any benefits that maybe come with, at the collegiate level, I guess I'm thinking largely, that come with some of the shortages? I mean, are you guys looking at that as an opportunity in terms of, educating more teachers or getting more people into the workforce in that way? Or how are you viewing that from an opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. The teacher shortage on the K-12 side is an opportunity on the higher education side, and really finding ways to reach both high school and adult students that choose to go back and get their education and go into the education field. During this past year, we worked with the state of Iowa on the education grants that they had offered throughout the year to try and bolster both the para-educator and the teacher education completion. So that is definitely an area of focus. But it's really, again, attracting those individuals that want to go into the education field.
Right. Do you find that people who go to a rural college are more likely to stay or to go work in a rural community if they're being educated to be like a K through 12 teacher? Is that like a tie that you see much of or not?
We do see some of it. Some of it depends on their placements,
Mhm.
and what their background, where they're coming from. So I would say that I don't know that there's a direct correlation there. It's probably more their experiences that they have as they're going through the student teaching and their field experiences, but then also, where they came to us from. Did they come from a larger urban setting, and that's really where they're looking to go back to because, that's where family, friends, or their comfort level is. Or did they just have a fantastic experience with a student teacher, at a very small district and just fell in love with it? So I think it's a little bit more individual for our students as they're going through.
Sure. Yeah, and this might be a question for Rob, but can you speak more generally? Like, are the challenges that we just heard here in Iowa, are they the same challenges that K through 12 and colleges are facing across the region in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is not just an Iowa issue. This is a Midwestern issue. And a lot of it boils down to population. So at Upper Iowa, you've got to bring a certain number of students in every year to be able to have to be able to make things run on time. And at the K-12 level, you're banking on population every year, and you're banking on population on October 1st of every year because that's what the state measures to figure out how much revenue you're going to get for the year. But with both of those situations in rural Iowa and the rural Midwest, you're seeing population start to decline. So we're right now on the cusp of what a lot of folks in higher education look at as a demographic cliff. So kids that were born or would have been born in the 2008, 2009, in the period of the Great Recession, families have fewer kids. Birth rates declined precipitously. So students coming out of schools, high schools, and in the next several years, those classes are going to start going down. And we're already seeing it. So there's more and more competition then at the higher education level for students to come in. And rural schools have to play that game and compete with urban schools for students for opportunities. One of the things we do a lot with campuses is really work to make sure that they're using retention, they're seeing as a benefit of retention or a tie to retention, the engagement that students have in their local communities, because the more connections that you build, the more relationships you build, the more you feel embedded in your local community while you're on that campus for 2, 3, or 4 years, the more likely you are to stay as a student and then to put down roots and maybe stay afterwards, like what Kathy was talking about with teachers and other professionals.
Yeah. And while we're talking about demographics, I am curious. I mean, when you look at the numbers in terms of percentage of population that do pursue higher ed after graduation, they are lower in some of the more rural parts of Iowa. I'm wondering, do you guys have thoughts about why that is, and if that is a focus for folks trying to increase enrollment at the higher ed level?
Yeah, I would definitely say one of the things playing a role is the economy, because right now students coming out of high school can definitely go out into the job market and get a position that, maybe a decade ago wouldn't have been available to them, right out of high school and at the salary level that they're at now. So that definitely plays a role in attracting students. And the other piece of it is, and I think you asked, whether that's part of our strategy, definitely looking to engage students locally is part of the strategy for a rural college, because back to Rob's point, just being a part of the communities is a really important piece, and not only just our community, but our surrounding communities as well, because in that rural setting, just having that recognition and awareness sometimes that a college education is possible, you could commute, that there are options there available for students. Sometimes that is a barrier that students aren't aware of as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Dr. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off of what Kathy said. I think absolutely everything she said is accurate. I think families and high school students are also trying to determine, that cost of higher education, and is that degree necessary? Maybe as a student, I've been involved in some apprenticeship programs, so I can more easily now from that K-12 setting move out into a really good paying job, and then I don't have that college debt either. So I think that is something that truly is on top of mind for our current students as well as families.
Mhm.
Yeah. Do you think that there's any additional counseling happening in rural, K through 12 schools right now, trying to get them to fill out FAFSA forms, talking about post graduation plans, anything like that, or has it stayed pretty stagnant?
I think to the extent that it's available, it's happening, but in Iowa, we've long had a shortage of school counselors at all levels, and have always fell behind the national school counselor rate of what's recommended. And so then, the question is, what are those counselors that are in those buildings able to do, and the connections that they're able to make with students. I talk to students all the time, just in my regular walk of life, who have never had college presented to them as an option, for a variety of reasons. And if we're not making the case to all of those students, to every single student, and letting them make an informed decision, then they're not going to follow those choices, because you can go out and get a job at Quick Trip down the road, and they'll put you on a managerial track. Now, you might still be managing that Quick Trip in 10 years, and that may not be what you want to do, but in that immediate 18, 19-year-old gets money in your pocket, makes a lot of sense. More sense than me telling you, well, you're going to, for the life of your career, you're going to earn a lot more if you complete that higher education degree.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if that's part of the, there's been so many partnerships that have popped up across the state when it comes to community colleges and private and public universities and colleges. Is that part of that, creating like a more succinct pipeline out of high school to a 4-year degree, as opposed to maybe just a 2-year certificate or something?
I definitely think so. I also think those partnerships are just critically important, because then students can see the path.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you go to the community college, sometimes there's uncertainty there, where now there are these pathways that take them all the way to degree completion, and students can follow that and can see that path, and and where they're going. And I think that is a really important piece, so that in the past, before many of the partnerships, I think it was a little more difficult for students that maybe just got an AA degree, and then what their next step would be. Now they can almost choose that right from the beginning, and they're taking coursework, that they know will articulate and transfer to their desired next step when they're done at the community college.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and Rob, earlier you kind of were talking about the shortage in counselors. And I was thinking that it's a little bit veering off a little bit here, but just about mental health too, and the needs there. I know that's been something that schools have talked about across the board, but is that happening in rural parts of Iowa and the Midwest as well?
It is, and it needs to, because the kind of the insecurity that students are facing now, and have for the last, let's just say the last 4 years since the start of the pandemic, has heightened. There's a lot more risk factors that are more prevalent in students today than before. We have data that we took from a survey from 2020, 1,000 college students. These are college students. It's not necessarily rural, but I think it tracks. It's a large enough sample. It tracks whether it's urban or rural. Over half of these students that were surveyed, that were current college students, noted that they had at least one form of basic needs insecurity. we understand that, if it's making ends meet, if it's financial insecurity, if it's housing insecurity, if it's food insecurity, these are the things that sap your bandwidth as a student and make it less likely that you're going to be able to matriculate, make it less likely you're going to be able to succeed, and are going to lead to worse outcomes. And we know poverty is something that connects both urban and rural Iowa and urban and rural Midwest. You look at some of the districts that Dr. Remy works with. Some of those districts are, you would think, the district with the highest percentage of free and reduced price lunch in the state is my district, is Des Moines. But after that, you've got districts in Page County, Clay County, Allen McKee that are profoundly serving profoundly poor population of students, all facing significant risk, all likely to address, to have some form of mental health challenge in their time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it makes me wonder if, given the correlation between some of the mental health issues and poverty and things like that, if the mental health stuff is kind of more significant in rural K through 12 education, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, and I think the continuum of services. So you may or may not have the school counselor, but in some cases, even when you do have the school counselor, the need is greater than what the school counselor can provide. And so then the lack of continuum of services in the rural part of our state is heightened for sure. There's a need across our state, I would say, for that continuum of services for mental health, but it is even more so heightened in those rural areas.
Right. Excuse me. Well, I'm wondering, when we're talking about some of the schools potentially struggling with enrollment, with short staff, have we seen any consolidation at the K through 12 level, or what are we seeing about closures even at the higher ed level? Excuse me.
Yeah, I wouldn't say from the K-12 level or pre-K-12 level, I wouldn't say that we've seen a lot. There's over time, there are some consolidations, most of the time at that secondary level, but I wouldn't say that in recent years we've seen an increased amount at the pre-K level, pre-K-12 level.
And I would say on the higher ed side, there's definitely an increase of closures on the higher education side nationwide. Some consolidations, but that's a little trickier at the higher education level on side to make those consolidations or mergers work. So more often we're seeing closures on that side, and really efforts really coming forward, I think, more in this upcoming year, where institutions are facing some budget shortfalls and beginning to, in essence, right-size their institution, because enrollment dropped from what it was pre-pandemic. This now seems like the new normal rather than, somewhat of a bounce back, like many institutions thought there may be, and many actually experts in the field predicted that there would be, an enrollment resurgence once the pandemic was over. This seems to be kind of where we're going to be on the higher ed side from an enrollment perspective. And so institutions are now taking steps to right size, offer these services, in the way they can. And so I think you're going to see that over the next couple of 3 years here for sure on the higher ed side.
Yeah, and is it, when you talk about the higher ed side, is it more significant within rural communities in terms of the implication and the right sizing that's happening? Or not? Is it just across the board?
I don't know, Rob, maybe you want to take it first and then.
Yeah, I would say it's happening everywhere. I don't think it's necessarily a rural challenge, although, rural higher education institutions, they have a greater challenge in lowering staff and faculty than colleges and universities based in urban areas, just by virtue of demographics. And so it can be challenging. What higher education is looking at for the next several years is how do you weather this downturn in students in the recruiting pipeline? Where can you grow where you can? What new partnerships can you have? How can you diversify your revenue? Higher education is coming out of about 3 years of increased revenue because of federal pandemic relief aid, which was able to offset some losses and keep things going. But that money is, basically not coming in any longer. So, a lot of things Kathy's looking at are happening everywhere. And now institutions have to decide, what are we going to offer? What are we not going to offer? And that directly then impacts whether students come to your campus. So it's a terrible decision to have to make of whether you're going to close or end up an offering or a program because it has an impact on your staff and sometimes your identity as an institution. But then it also impacts the students that you're going to bring in or not. And so, a lot of our institutions, whether they're urban or rural, are facing that question right now.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is really important for rural institutions, and something that Upper Iowa has been doing for many years now, is really that diversification of revenue sources is really an important piece right now. So not only do we have our rural campus, but we have an extensive online, and we have locations in other states as well, serving adult markets. So really finding those new paths of revenue sources, not abandoning, your traditional rural setting, but also having some other revenue sources that kind of help weather this storm, as we're going through some of these enrollment challenges.
Yeah. When you're talking about diversifying revenue, are you talking about just still looking at tuition revenue largely, but getting it from different populations? Or are you looking at philanthropy and totally different, different collaborations or totally different sorts of income generation?
Yeah, so I was referring to really just different populations, in different streams. Many rural institutions are tuition dependent. And so having those different revenue and diversified models is really an important strategy. But certainly the fundraising and the alumni support and those efforts, are increasingly important as well during these times.
Yeah. And when we're talking about, obviously, Iowa Wesleyan recently closed within Mount Pleasant. And I was wondering if you all could talk at all about the tie and how important education and educational institutions are to communities and sort of what the implications are for rural parts of the region if institutions are closing.
Yeah, so if you look at Upper Iowa, we are one of the largest employers in the Northeast Iowa area here. We did do an economic impact study here just in FY22, which had just over an $18 million economic impact for the area. So when you start talking about broadly what an institution brings to the community, again, not only the community that we're servicing, but the several communities and counties surrounding it, it's pretty significant in the rural areas.
I'll double down on that and say, in addition to everything Kathy said, then there's a civic impact as well. So a lot of your faculty and your staff are going to be also your school board members, or they're going to be in the board of your United Way. They're going to be the folks who are raising hands and are part of that community and are deeply invested in it. And when a rural community loses an institution of higher education, then they lose a lot of that human infrastructure that makes the community function and makes it a very livable community.
And I would jump in even with the pre-K-12, in many instances, the school system may be the largest employer as well, depending upon the town or city. And so if the school closed, or even the high school closed because they consolidated with another community and the high school went to a different community, that definitely has an economic impact on that community as well.
Yeah. And I just was thinking about sort of COVID and some of the implications. And obviously, during that period of time, so many schools and districts had to go online. Can you talk at all about sort of the digital divide? Was that more of a challenge in rural areas? And is it still like, is there still a divide there, or has everybody sort of caught up?
Yeah, I think school pre-K through 12 schools did everything they could to try to minimize that concern at the rural area, but there's definitely infrastructure. And I still believe there's some infrastructure concerns across our state in that digital area. But I do know that, people picked up with hotspots and did everything they could to try to minimize that. But it is more of a challenge in some of our rural communities versus our urban.
More cost, I think. It's more costly per person in rural Iowa to be able to bring broadband. But it is still a challenge that draws the line between both urban and rural. We handed out hundreds of hotspots in the spring and then fall of 2020 in Des Moines, because we had of our 30,000 students, thousands of them that just did not have access to internet. And if you think about it, it's not just a pandemic related issue either. Our phones are how we get all the information we use these days. So, if you don't have consistent access to, when you're a student and you're trying to write a paper, it's not like the Encyclopedia Britannica any longer. You're going to go online, you're going to find information, and your teacher is going to help you figure out if it's valid information and how to make those determinations. But if you have access to that, and because we don't have great access in large stretches of rural Iowa, then those students are at a deficit relative to their peers when it comes to applying to college and succeeding when they get to college.
Right. Is the state of Iowa doing anything, or has it done anything to sort of build that infrastructure and to close that gap, that divide when it comes to digital stuff? Do any of you know?
Yeah, I don't have specifics, but I do know that has been a priority for Governor Reynolds, and working through trying to bring resources to that infrastructure, but I don't have specifics.
Yeah, well, I mean, speaking of some of the legislature stuff, though, obviously, there were some education-related bills passed this last session, and I'm wondering if any of you can speak to the implications for rural education. And I'm thinking kind of specifically, too, about the one that allows funding for private education and for students that want to pursue that path instead of going to the public school. Is that having an impact in rural Iowa?
Yeah, I think, I'll speak a little bit to it. I think it's a little bit too early to know for sure. We know that the information that we have at this time is there's a little over 18,000 students or families who have requested the educational savings accounts. And I say requested because you first do that application process, you find out if you're approved, but then you have to, apply or see if you can get into a private school option. And so because there's over 18,000 that applied and are approved, doesn't mean that they're all going to find spots within that private school system. And so there is some concern about equity there. And then when you think about our role there, I think, if I remember correctly, there's like 41 of our 99 counties that there aren't even options for a private school. So that impacts our rural. If I'm a family in the rural part of our state where I don't have a private school option, really that educational savings account isn't available to me at this time. Now, from a public school perspective, what we're hearing is that there could be some private school options that open up within the next year. And so then if students move from that public to a private, and that reduces more student enrollment, which then funding is reduced, that could exasperate some of our rural communities that already have small student enrollment numbers currently. And if more choose to go the other route, then that becomes a challenge for them as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so when you're talking about new schools potentially opening, would those be in the rural communities in terms of the private options, or would they largely be in like nearby urban centers, or do you know?
Well, I think it could be all of the above. I've heard some information that there are private school possibilities to open up in some of the rural communities in those counties where there isn't an option, so that families have an option.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I was just looking into the chat because we were getting a question perhaps, or maybe a comment, but one says if there is no private school in a rural area, perhaps then the local school won't experience any impact, except the SSA was increased 3%. So maybe that's just a comment and not a question. Yeah,
that is accurate. Currently, SSA was increased this year at 3%. Those public school districts where there are private school options and students may choose that option and are approved, there's spots available, then that public school is receiving some funds as well. So we'd have some of our public schools getting a few extra dollars than other public schools where there aren't private school options, which was a concern in the conversation prior to this passing last legislative session as well. Sure. That funding equity.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I wonder, have you heard whether, among teachers and educators, we're talking about shortages and staff shortages. Is this something that they're talking about or thinking about or care about in terms of like the public education teachers?
Yeah, I think, so I haven't directly been in conversation with teachers, administrators really, but I do believe that this is a conversation, the educational savings account is a conversation that teachers, administrators all are talking about and wondering how that will impact the public schools in Iowa.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and I guess I wanted to ask too, like, what are things that need to happen? What are opportunities that you see in rural Iowa or rural education areas, or what are ways that people can support rural education, given its importance to the economy and the state?
I would say from a higher education vantage point, encourage, to have families come and take a look at higher education, rural campuses. They are very different. And when I was in the recruiting business more strongly, I would say, go visit a public, visit a private, you will know very quickly where you feel at home, and so I think it's opening up your process to really include the possibility of a rural institution, so that, and then it's on the rural institutions also to make sure that people know about it, and really trying to get our message out as well. But that definitely is, I think, something that some of our students will say quite often is that, they were so glad they came, because if they didn't come and visit, they would have never even considered, because from the surface, it may not seem like what they want, but then they get here and it has that community feel, that kind of small, so it really does depend what a student is looking for. So I would say that is one way that definitely people can help support and just take a look. It's not right for everyone, but there definitely is an important place for it.
Yeah, and you talk about the size and the field, but what are some other aspects of a smaller, like, going to college at a smaller school in a smaller community?
Yeah, going to school at a smaller institution, I mean, you have the ability to get much more involved, you know, and be involved in various things than what you could maybe at a larger institution. You also have the ability to get, I think Rob mentioned earlier, to be involved in the community at a much higher level, because you're ingrained into the community during your time at the institution, which is, I think, sometimes very different than what you get at more of a larger institution setting or an urban setting.
Right, yeah. We are getting another question here, so I'll just read out to you. I'm curious if panel members have ideas how to get K through 12 students or college students interested and enthusiastic about finding a path in the teaching profession.
Yeah, I would say that there are examples in the pre-K through 12 setting of like teacher academies, I will call them, at that high school level. So there's a CAPS program, for example, in Cedar Falls, where one of the strands is a teacher academy program. So they're learning, and then they're having a field experience in maybe an elementary or middle school, or even at the high school level, depending upon what level that they would consider teaching. And so it's similar to some of those apprenticeships or other types of real world, I'll call them, experiences that we're trying to get high school students involved in to see if it's something that is really what they want to do. You know, it's always good to have those experiences in high school, from my perspective, to determine, you know, is this a field that I'm really passionate about? This is what I want to do, prior to that 2 or 4 year college path. So the Educator program is another, you know, really good program that the state started a year or so ago, and so continuing that path. But really, I applaud our schools that are looking at ways to involve their high school students in a class that then they have some experience as well.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking on that a little bit, this isn't necessarily for younger students, but hasn't Iowa and different colleges making creating more pathways for people who are already working adults to decide to do teaching without like going back and getting like an undergrad in education? Aren't there more ways of getting there now than previously?
I think the primary way right now that, and Lisa just mentioned it, is the Educator grant that the state did implement. It allows students the opportunity to get in the classroom, does not, you know, allow them the ability to become a teacher. They would still need to go through the degree, you know, and meet the requirements for that. But I think what it does do is get them in the classroom and in some ways make sure that that is what they really want to do before that time and commitment of going back to school.
Yeah,
Iowa has a higher licensure requirement than a lot of other states do for K-12 teachers, and that's not a bad thing at all. I think that's a strength. But then at times like this, where it's honestly getting harder and harder to get more educators in the workforce, then we have to be more creative in finding ways to find new teachers. And you know, I think Moyne did a really good job in identifying folks who are already working for the district but weren't licensed educators, and providing them in a partnership with Drake University a way to get their teaching certification paid for, so that they could then move into the teaching field. That's, you know, and that's the type of thing you can do if you have a higher education partner that's right there, present in your community or accessible to you, which is why then having more infrastructure for education in rural Iowa is really important, because it's more than just a K-12 question of how do we get more teachers into our work.
right. I mean, of course, raising salaries is always one good way to get people interested. And one commenter said the legislature helped rural schools by removing silo dollars, so releasing $154 million for teacher salaries. Is that something that you guys think will have a meaningful impact or has already? Do teachers, are people aware of this in those rural towns?
Well, I believe the dollars that they're referencing are around the teacher leadership and compensation dollars. And so each of our school districts had a teacher leadership program in place. And so then individual districts will be making those decisions whether they want to continue that program and or use those dollars for teacher salaries. And so really for this school year wasn't much change, and that will come as people are having discussions because of when they got the guidance from the state. After that was passed last spring, there was not a large change of districts that use those dollars differently for this school year, but that we may see a difference coming up for the 24-25 school year.
Sure. Yeah, I'm wondering a little bit about brain drain. I mean, I know that is a concern among lawmakers and everybody, that we are sort of educating people, bringing them up through training them, and then not keeping them. Then they're maybe leaving and going and working in another state or doing something. I mean, is that something that's becoming more of a concern for Iowa, or what are we seeing in that regard?
Yeah, I think that's a concern here. I really do. I had a meeting this morning with someone in Minnesota and was learning a little bit more about a idea behind a fellowship program to incentivize graduates of maybe an urban institution that came from a rural community, figure out some pathways to get them back into their small town upon graduation. And that's something that we're looking at and kind of strategizing around, trying to see if we can find a way to do that. I absolutely want students moving back home to their small towns. I mean, it's an individual choice, but overall, our state will succeed based on how strong our small towns and communities are.
Right. I know, like the University of Iowa, even for a while, did that with doctors, that they incentivized them to go do their practicums or whatever in rural communities by using money, obviously, and scholarship stuff. So I don't know. I mean, is anything that like that in the works for teachers to try to attract them with like pay, into smaller towns?
I'm not aware of anything on a state level. I do know that there are districts that have talked about, are there ways to find dollars for recruitment strategies as well as retention dollars? So they're continuing district by district to have those conversations and to have those, see if they can find dollars that they could utilize towards those strategies. But nothing, I'm not aware currently of anything at a state level.
Yeah, since this is Iowa Ideas Week, let me put an Iowa idea on the table here, which is this is legislation that's been in the legislature for a few years now, is to allow some more targeted student loan forgiveness that's tax-free for rural communities to bring trained professionals back home. Right now, employers can offer loan forgiveness, but it's a taxable benefit. It's taxed just like your wages are taxed. If we had more ability to forgive student loans for professions that school districts can't necessarily, rural school districts can't offer a lot more salary to compete with urban or suburban school districts. It's just they don't have that type of economic flexibility. So let's figure out some ways to give them a few more tools in the tool belt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Are there other amenities that would be nice to add to rural schools that would be helpful in attracting people home in terms of, I mean, we talked a little bit about some of them, but transportation and things like that? Or what are the facility statuses? Like, is there deferred maintenance that just makes buildings hard to teach in these days? And is that different than what we're looking at in urban schools?
thankfully, I would say that our rural schools are in a much better place than some of our urban schools in terms of facilities. We've had statewide dedicated state sales tax dollars for building maintenance and new construction for 20 years now, I believe. And just by sheer economy of scale, that money actually goes farther in rural communities because you have fewer buildings to maintain and upkeep than you do in some of the larger communities. So I think the legislature's discussed, I don't know if they've ever taken action on this, but discussed, some more flexibility with that. But, the rural districts that I've spent time in have had great facilities, and have been able to invest in those. And that is frankly a strength right now for Ohio.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Well, and so I guess I just was wondering, I mean, when we're looking at, Kathy, when you're looking at recruiting students to college, are you thinking, like, obviously enrollment for your own campus is crucial, and that is like the primary concern, but are you thinking when you're recruiting folks about keeping them in Iowa? Is that part of your college's mission? Or is it mostly just to get them good degrees,
Obviously to get degrees, but we also have been really strategically thinking about focusing on the Iowa student, because I do believe that if you keep a student in Iowa, there is a better chance that they go back home. Once they leave the state, that really decreases pretty dramatically. But so we've implemented what we call Peacock Promise, for students that on the FAFSA have a 0 EFC, they come to school at Upper Iowa free. So we're trying to do things. We've reset our tuition to $19,000 so that, because what we have learned over the years is sometimes that sticker price, even though everyone knows you don't pay that, that sticker price becomes a non-conversation then, because families don't think that they can even afford it, even with some kind of discount or scholarship, because the dollar amount is so high. So those are the kinds of things that we're trying to do to really make sure that it's accessible, so that we can get that first conversation, and really have that meaningful discussion about, Upper Iowa University is a possibility, for your child, and it is possible, for them to afford it, and all of the things that go with it. So I don't know that it's a direct strategy to keep people in Iowa, but it's definitely a strategy to recruit Iowa students.
Right. And are colleges incentivized in any way to get college students to stay and then to keep them after graduation, or not?
No.
Okay. Yeah. What would you like to see? Some sort of incentive?
Always. I mean, and the private colleges are different because they're not, publicly funded, based on enrollment and some of those things. So it is a different funding structure than what, the pre-K-12 system is and the public systems. But keeping students in Iowa is really important for the state at this point.
Yeah. So I guess just in closing, as we're kind of coming to the end, I wonder if each of you could just talk a little bit about what your hope is for rural Iowa, what you would like to see happen in the coming years, and where you'd like the conversation to be a decade from now, talking about rural education.
I guess for me and, in our rural community, what I'd really like to see is for the community to kind of resurge, where there's an opportunity for small businesses, to really come back in and thrive. Because when your community is thriving, there's that spillover effect that you have. A lot of things become easier, you're in for us at the institution, but as the community as a whole. And I think what we've really seen over the past several years is those small businesses really struggling to make it in the small communities. And I think that if that ability comes back, there'd be other things that would follow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, when I think about your question and I think about pre-K through 12, what I hope in those rural communities, or all communities, but I'll specifically rural, is, the community really supports and rallies around their education systems. It's a partnership between the schools and the community, to also tell the story of all the great things that are happening. There's a lot of great programming that students are involved in. They're out in doing internships, et cetera. So really highlight those, talk about those so people know what's happening in those rural communities, because there's a lot of great things happening. And so just continuing to tell those stories and to support those, the school district and the community together, because it takes the village.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just such a significant civic investment that K-12, pre-K-12 and higher education make in our state, in rural communities especially, that we can't undersell. The other thing that I will add is, some of the more thriving rural communities are communities that are attracting new Iowans. We haven't talked much about demographics in this hour that we've been together, but communities like Storm Lake or Hampton or Denison or West Liberty have thriving main streets. They have their school districts are growing, and it's largely because of first and second generation Iowa families that are coming in and claiming a space in rural small town Iowa.
Mhm.
And we need to celebrate that. We need to ask those families what they want. These are historically the families that are going to have high aspirations for their kids. They're going to work 60-hour weeks to make sure that their kid does not have to. And so we need to ask them what they want, to give them a seat at the table, and allow them to help start to steer the future for their families as well.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're pretty much out of time, but there was one more question. So I'll just throw it out and maybe one of you can answer it, or if you can collectively answer it. It says, what are the top 3 amenities you feel students are demanding or wanting to see right now?
Students want economic security. They want to know what job they're going to get, whether it's after high school or college. They want their voice to be heard. They don't want people to speak for them. And I think they want, depending on where they are, they want basic needs and services. It could be as simple as food insecurity that they need accessed, or it could be broadband like we talked about earlier. Those are the 3 that come to mind for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Thank you so much for doing this, and thanks for everybody who's listening in. I really appreciate it, and I learned a lot. So thanks so much, and check back in for our main event later this year. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.